My first actual foray into the sport of boxing, other than just being a fan, was I was going to the State University of New York at Brockport in the late 70s, and I became acquainted with this young middleweight, John Griffin, who was a fellow student there. He had transferred to Brockport from Siena. And John was his name was, everybody called him Griff. His name was Gentleman John Griffin. He was 4-0 as a pro, and he was fighting out of Albany, New York, which is across the state from Brockport. So I got to know him very well, and I was a journalism major, so he was going to go to Albany, New York to train for the Christmas vacation under the auspices, or under the stewardship of Dave Zigowitz, who had fought Joe Frazier for the title in 1969. So I got this grand idea that I would go with him, and I was welcomed with open arms by Dave Zigowitz into his home, and I would live with John Griffin for that month. Every day he would get up and do his road work. I would do the road work with him. He would go to the gym. If he hit the bag for 3 rounds, I would hit the bag for 3 rounds, even though I never hit a bag before. But everything he did, I would do. And I was going to do a series of articles for the school newspaper called The Stylus about the life of a boxer, a boxing college student or something like that. He was going to have a fight, I think it was January 9th, 1979. He was going to have a fight in Hartford, Connecticut. It was going to be his 5th pro fight. And there was a local heavyweight whose opponent had fell out for some reason. So I begged Dave Zigowitz to get me on the show, and so he was very resistant. He said, this guy, his name was Dick Embleton. He had about 7 fights already. His record was like 3-2-2 or something. But I convinced him, and now I had to convince Willie Pep, who was the commissioner, that I had experience. And back then it was a lot easier to talk your way into the ring than it is today. There were no computerized statistics or anything. So I was introduced to Willie Pep and the doctor at the same time. And Willie Pep said, Ziggy, where'd you find this big guy? Or something like that. And Ziggy said he had some fights in Florida. he had a bunch of fights in Florida. And Willie Pep said, yeah, kid, who'd you fight? And he started mentioning some promoters' names. So I think I just muttered, and Ziggy kind of helped me through it. But I wound up in the ring that night. I had a very good first round. I remember coming back to the corner, Ziggy saying, you look like Muhammad Ali out there, what are you doing? But the next round I got flattened with a left hook to the nose, and I hit the canvas face first. My nose was gushing blood. But I was on my feet. I got up and finished on my feet. And that was my inauspicious debut. But it was a lot of fun, and I wound up doing it a couple more times, but this without much success, without any success. But there was one time I was in Albany, actually before this fight, like my second week training in Albany, there was a fight card there. And I was told I was going to work some guy's corner. And I don't mean to tell secrets, but everybody knows this kind of stuff happened back then. So I was told, you're going to work this guy's corner. Somebody gave me a towel and a bucket or something. And I said, I never did this before. You sure it's, just don't worry about it. You're going to be okay. So I'm walking the guy into the ring, and the guy's, he's very well built. He's from New England, but he's stiff as a board. He's not sweaty. He looks like he's going to the gallows. And I said, you're going to be all right, because I saw the other guy, and the other guy didn't look that formidable. My guy actually looked more formidable, and this guy blurts out, but he's a pro, man. So I didn't really know what to make of it, but I was trying to do the right thing. I'm, swaddling him down with water. He wound up getting stopped like in 25 seconds, so they were right. I didn't have to really do anything. But even that type of shenanigans and hijinks, it was addicting. It was, and I could tell 1,000 stories like that. But that's what boxing was like back then. And a lot of people would be repulsed at the grassroots level that stuff happened. But from a journalistic, a fledgling journalist, this was all grist. This was like foreplay to the real thing. I saw that same guy 2 or 3 years later back in Albany under under a different name fighting. And I said hello, and he said he remembered me. So I guess he realized, I could pick up a few bucks. I'm not going to get hurt. There's always somebody there to stop. I didn't have to stop the fight my night. Somebody, I don't know if the fight was bought and paid for, but the guy was so kind of helpless in the ring. I don't think anybody would have had to pay him to lose. Dave Ziggy was a wonderful guy. He tough as nails. I mean, he really came up the hard way. For people that don't know his story, he got out of the Navy. He was an all-service champion, meaning he beat people in all the different armed forces, and he was the champion of all the armed forces. And he just loved he loved every aspect of boxing. I remember when we were training in the Christmas break in this cold gym, and he was going, this is the hard part. You're in this gym freezing your balls off. He says, in the ring, it's going to be in a warm arena. He says this is, and but he made me believe in myself. He made me want to get into that ring. And I remember when the fight was over, I think I made $150, and he said, I'm going to take $50 from you. And he said, you stayed at my house, we fed you. He didn't say it that way. He was like making excuses for why he had to take $50. That's what his wife made me and knitted me some shorts and she wrote Big Bob on them. And Dave said, honey, you don't put Big Bob, and nobody wants to be big anything, when you go into somebody else's hometown. So he was just a really good guy that just absolutely loved boxing, every level of it, and he loved helping young people get a better direction and feel better about themselves.
Did he ever talk about the Frazier fight?
Talked about the Frazier fight all the time. He said he dreamt about that fight every night because the fight was over in 96 seconds. But for that 96 seconds, Ziggy gave as good as he got. It's on YouTube. They were slugging away, with left hooking each other. But he said he would joke that he had nightmares about the fight, and he fought him every night in his dreams. But he had nothing but the highest respect for Joe Frazier as a fighter and as a human being. But Ziggy lived in the gym. He was called the mail order heavyweight because he answered an ad for these businessmen in Texas that wanted to create a heavyweight from the ground up. So he contacted them. He got a bus ticket. He lived in the gym. The soda machine was his refrigerator. He would shove his food into this soda machine somehow. And he answered the phone when Cleveland Williams was shot by the state trooper. He was the one that answered the phone and notified the gym owners. And one thing that made me realize Ziggy was not a BS artist, he was so proud of his ruggedness and durability and toughness. But he admitted without any embarrassment or equivocation that they wouldn't let him spar with Cleveland Williams, and they wouldn't let him spar with George Foreman when Foreman came home from the Olympics in 1968. And he wanted to spar with them, but they wouldn't let him. Maybe I guess they thought those guys were so powerful that they might hurt him. But the fact that Ziggy was willing to admit that shows to me that he wasn't a BS artist, and all of his grand tales had truth to them. Right. 1979, I was in Florida, and I went to visit the offices of Hank Kaplan, the very famous in boxing circles, boxing collector. And he had started a magazine called Hank Kaplan's Worldwide Boxing Digest. So I went there and I kind of volunteered my services. I said I could be like the upstate New York correspondent because there were fights back then in Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo. He wound up contacting me a few weeks later, And Rocky Fratto, who was a junior middleweight from Geneva, New York, he was fighting at the an arena in Rochester. I think it was the Rochester Dome Arena, and he was fighting Steve, the fighting school teacher, Michelera. They had just fought in Elmira a couple of months earlier. It was a very disputed decision, so this was a rematch. So he wanted me to write like a 350, 400-word article, and he wanted photographs to go along with it for a full-page feature in the magazine. So me being a journalism major, this is like my first paid article. I was absolutely thrilled, but I had told him I knew how to operate a camera, which I really didn't know how to do. And you really had to know the mechanics of a camera back then. There was no such thing as, I don't even think there were Instamatics yet. So I was in a bit of a panic. I went to the journalism department where I knew everybody, and I know they had a very good photography club there. So I asked if they could recommend somebody that could come with me to the fight later that night. This is literally like with hours to spare. And they contacted Joel Rifkin, who was a couple of years younger than me, but he was like this star of the photography department. They called him. He came down with bags of cameras. He was like this long-haired, shaggy, long-haired guy. He came down. He was very rumpled, but he had a backpack and an ankle or a shoulder harness with all these cameras in there. We wound up going to the Fratto fight, covering the fight, which was a great fight. But what was even greater from a journalistic standpoint was the riot that ensued afterwards, because Rocky Fratto, even though he was a local favorite, he won a decision he really didn't deserve, and the crowd went nuts. So Joel wound up getting all these shots of chairs flying through the air in the ring. And we sold many of these photos, or he sold these photos to the two daily newspapers up there. We were like at these newspaper offices in the wee hours of the morning. They developed the film for us. They were treating us like big shots. Oh, you got, they're looking at them with the glass, and they go, oh, this is a good one. This is a good one. So it was a really big deal. And the photographer, years later, it was learned, he dropped out of school shortly after our encounter, although we were somewhat friendly, and he wound up becoming New York State's most prolific serial killer. He killed 17 prostitutes. He was arrested, I think in '92, which would have been about 12, 13 years after we had done this, shared this very formative experience together.
What did you think of him then? What was his personality like?
He was a guy from Long Island, just another young kid, trying to find his way. In hindsight, he was probably as insecure as me. But there was something that really stood out about him that I remember very vividly, and that really impressed me. On the way there, before all the excitement of the riot and selling these pictures, he told me that he was very bored with school. He just wanted to open up a photography studio, and he didn't articulate that he wanted to be different by doing this, but one of the ideas he had was to learn how to parachute, and he was going to open up this business that offered photography of weddings being done in midair, parachuting from a plane, and the vows and everything being taken in midair. And I've seen that. Over the years, I've seen that later. But that was the first time I had heard of that or even thought of that. So he really thought outside the box. And I said, wow, this guy's really sharp. And I got the impression that he was too smart and too creative to be locked into a college setting. So when he dropped out and I lost touch with him, and my journalistic dreams didn't pan out, and I wound up joining the police department, feeling like a civil service sellout, I always kind of assumed that he was out there shooting for National Geographic or Life magazine or some of these big magazines, when in reality he was euphemistically living in his mother's basement, failing at every endeavor he tried, being a gardener, working in a liquor store. and winds up, becoming this mad dog killer. So I was very wrong about him.
And you interviewed him many years later, right? You did a prison interview with him. Just talk about that. Seeing him.
Yeah, when he first got arrested in the early '90s, I wanted to know more. I was really curious about how he wound up the way he did. But I was very wary, being an active cop, of inserting myself in any way in such a major investigation. So I just kind of minded my own business. But years later, after he had been convicted and was up in Attica serving, over 200-year sentence, I saw him interviewed by Geraldo Rivera. And Geraldo asked him if he had any remorse for the people he killed. And the reason he asked him that question is Joel had this 23-page handwritten manifesto called the Aloha House. And I believe Aloha means sanctuary in Hebrew, and Joel was Jewish. And the Aloha House was offered warnings of how unsuspecting females, especially prostitutes, and people that could be prey to predators like Joel, how they could protect themselves from people like him. So this was going to be his give back to the world. And so, it sounded reasonable. I was very interested in his description of that. And then Geraldo said, "Do you feel bad for any of the women that you killed?" And this is what really grabbed me from a journalistic standpoint, because by this time I had done some writing, so I had, wet my beak in the journalistic field. Joel said, "No, I want to feel remorse. I want to feel bad for what I did, but I can't, and I don't know why." And rather than pounce on that from a journalistic perspective, Geraldo said, if I remember correctly, "I'd like to leap over this table and choke the life out of you just the way you did those innocent women." So I felt like he lost this tremendous opportunity to get into this guy's head. And I think the very next day I wrote to Joel in Attica and told him, who I was, and hoped he remembered me. And I would love to ask more questions. I did tell him I was an active cop, but I was writing to him solely as a journalist, and anything he told me, would not be judged. I didn't hear from him initially, but I wrote him another letter maybe 3 weeks later, and I got an immediate response, and he agreed to meet, and agreed to a magazine article, and that magazine article led to another magazine article, which led to a book that was published in 2001, called "From the Mouth of the Monster: The Joel Rifkin Story."
Did he remember the Rocky Frat fight?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Actually, in the first letter, he recounted lots of details about he actually remembered his name and everything.
One thing, Bob, I always enjoy about your stories, your articles, is that you, and maybe because I remember the era so vividly and stuff, but you find the people. It almost feels like to me, these guys need a story told, and you give them that. What draws you to that?
I don't remember if it was Pete Hamill or Jimmy Breslin that said this, but it really had a tremendous impact on me when I read some of their boxing stories from the 50s and early 60s. And just the fact, it just was so deep and profound. Anybody can find a good story in the winner's dressing room. But the real story, and actually it might have been Gay Talese that said this, the real story is in the loser's dressing room. But nobody ever goes into the loser's dressing room. And I became fascinated with these guys that lose the big ones, or they never get to the big ones because they lose along the way. They have such tremendous stories to tell, like a guy like Ziggy. His story it's such a tremendous story of human suffering. He had his insides burned in a smokestack accident. He was in a in a bubble for almost 3 or 4 months, and was told he was going to live a tubercular existence for the rest of his life, and he wound up having a comeback. And I just find that so many of those people's stories are never told, and they just get forgotten. And I would get so angry at some of my colleagues when they would criticize me for doing stories on these people. Like, what are you writing about him for? He's a nobody. And to me, there's no such thing as a nobody in the sport of boxing, especially somebody that fought contenders or champions.
What's the story that's still the most intriguing to you? The most, like, you think back and, like, a guy you interviewed who you like, I actually can't believe I'm sitting across from this guy.
There is an instance, was probably one of the most powerful moments of my writing career, but for all the wrong reasons. Because I was out in California I was covering like a big show with young Mexican fighters. I think Marco Antonio Barrera was on the show. He was like 19 years old at the time. I wound up contacting Jerry Quarry, and I drove out to his house in Hemet, California, which is out in the desert. I drove out there with a high school friend of mine that really had no interest in boxing, but had obviously knew who Jerry Quarry was. And this was when Jerry was like in the beginning of dementia. That Los Angeles Times story came out that said that he was not doing well. And I felt like I was sitting next to a vegetable. You know, he was able to talk, but you know, he really wasn't able to articulate much. So here I am, you know, sitting with one of my heroes, it was, you know, we were able to, you know, get some commentary from him. But that led me to become very kind of intertwined with the Quarry family. I wound up getting to know Mike, getting to know Bobby. Bobby took me to see the father in a nursing home in Bakersfield. And the father was charming all the nurses, you know, and pointing to pictures of his handsome son, saying, "Those are all my boys." And so my whole interaction over several years with the Quarry family was probably one of the most rewarding yet disturbing chapters in my writing career.
And just for context, because I mean, obviously we know, but people watching this may not know. Just to describe how popular Quarry was and how tough he was.
Jerry Quarry was probably the most popular heavyweight in history to never win a world title. He had knocked out 5 opponents in a row in 1965 in the National Golden Gloves tournament in Kansas City. He turned pro with tremendous fanfare. He was handsome. He was articulate. He was so popular in like California early in his career. He was a guest star on TV shows like Adam 12 and I Dream of Jeannie. He traveled around the world for fights, and there was always, you know, legions of fans out there to see him. He was enormously popular, and but he never seemed to win the big fight. You know, he lost to Joe Frazier, he lost to Ken Norton, he lost to Muhammad Ali. But that really never hurt his popularity. And then he later became a TV announcer. He was fantastic as a TV announcer. Witty, quick, articulate, knowledgeable. But then he made these ill-advised comebacks. Plus there was talk of there being some other problems with alcohol and drugs. And he just wound up becoming like the poster boy for pugilistic dementia.
Right.
And died from that. I'm drinking in Graziano's one night about 2:30 in the morning with Bob Foster. And Bob Foster is regaling me with stories. So he tells me, and this is when you really know how rough the boxing business is, even for nice guys. Because Foster was basically a nice guy. But he says, when I knocked my Quarry out, I saw his eyes dancing around, and he was twitching, and I told my manager, I think he's dead. And the manager said, business is business.
Wow.
Yeah. That's been some of the stuff I wrote. These are the type of stories that really mesmerize me the most, are the people that very few people remember, but they left their mark. So there was a guy by the name of Leroy Caldwell. If you're a big muscle-bound guy, if you look back on his record in the 60s and 70s, you'll notice so many people on his record, big names, George Foreman, George Chuvalo, really big names, but he lost to all of them. Jerry Quarry is on there. So I met him probably in the early 2000s. He was accompanying a woman from India who was fighting out of Las Vegas. He was training her, and they were in the Bronx. So I was all excited to meet Leroy Caldwell because I had been reading about him in magazines. I knew he had a very lengthy record, albeit a losing one, but those are the type of people that appeal to me the most. And I know there's a small amount of people that like my writing that appreciate those stories. There's not many of them, but there's a few, and I always hear from the same ones, and it's always so great to hear from them. What mesmerized me about Leroy Caldwell was the fact, the one anecdote he told me. I knew he had fought in South Africa. He fought Jerry Quarry over there. And he told me about, as a visiting black athlete at the height of apartheid, he said he really wasn't treated that badly, and he was allowed to go to he was given a pass if he wanted to go to a movie theater, where he would be allowed into a whites-only movie theater with an escort. The escort had to be a white local person that would, accompany him. So just getting he was over there for like a week and a half, and just getting like the day-to-day life of going to a country like that where you're unwanted, basically, but they're making accommodations because you're a visiting athlete fighting this big local hero. And he had a very articulate description of what that was like for him. And to me, that was gold. That was journalistic gold.
Just explain the Doc Anderson story.
I read an article on Tim Doc Anderson, who was convicted of killing his manager, who was kind of a ne'er-do-well. And I was so fascinated by the story because he had admitted to shooting the guy like 9 times, and that I had to find out what was really behind it. I knew there had to be more to this. So I wound up writing to Doc in prison in Florida. We wrote back and forth. I visited him, probably 10 times in the past 15, 20 years. But one of my stories was entitled Misdemeanor Homicide, because even though what he did was pretty horrific, there was a lot of justification. Not that there's ever justification for murder, but if there was, this would be the case. Because I got to know Doc's family. They were all threatened, either directly or peripherally, by the murder victim, including one of the family members that was threatened was his paraplegic sister. Even the victim's sister said to me something along the lines of, "I always knew somebody was going to kill my brother. I just didn't think it would be Doc." But Doc was convicted of premeditated murder, and my argument in my stories was, if he brought 2 witnesses with him, he says he was carrying a gun for his own protection. He didn't run away. He went to the front desk and said, "I just killed my manager," and then he waited, for the police to arrive. That's not a premeditated. That's a man that's out of his mind. So give him his 20 years or 15, 20 years and let him out. He never had any trouble with the law prior to that. When they convicted him of first-degree murder, 2 or 3 jurors, and I have the letters, wrote to the judge, and they said, had we known that there was a mandatory life without parole sentence, we never would have convicted him of murder. We would have done what's called a jury nullification, which means we kind of know he did it, but we're going to acquit him. We're not going to say he's not guilty. We're just going to We're not going to say he's innocent. We're just going to say he's not guilty. It's a waste of a jail space to have this guy in jail after all this time. He's been in since '95 now, and I can't imagine he's going to hurt anybody else. But he has really, literally no chance of ever getting out.
And just summarize him quickly as a fighter.
Doc Anderson was a very, I don't like to call fighters average or subpar or anything, but by the standards of measure in the boxing world, he was very average. He was a lot better baseball player than he was a boxer. He had played in the Chicago Cubs organization, a minor league organization, but he had forsake that career in order to be a pro boxer because he loved boxing so much. But he fought Larry Holmes. He got stopped in the first round. He did have a pretty good win over Jimmy Young, an aging Jimmy Young. But what got him into all the trouble was 2 fights that he had with a football star turned pro boxer named Mark Gastineau. Doc refused to take a dive in the first fight and then agreed to fight a rematch, and that set off the whole chain of events that led to him killing his manager.
Just talk about the influence law enforcement or NYPD had on your life.
For the first 10 or 15 years of my police career, I always felt like I disappointed myself by choosing civil service over what I really wanted to do, which was be a journalist. But looking back, it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. It gave me the ability to immerse myself in so many worlds. It's led directly or indirectly to me being involved in movies now, as a screenwriter and actor. During the Colombo crime war of the early 90s, I was working in Brooklyn South at the time. That's where all the murders were happening. Every time there was a shooting, of which every couple of days was another one, 2 detectives from every precinct squad, at least 2, usually was more, had to respond. So when this guy, Nick Grancia, was killed on 86th Street in Brooklyn, that wasn't my precinct, but because it was in the same borough, we all had to converge on the crime scene. And that murder was committed by a guy by the name of Larry Mazza, who, we didn't know who he was at the time, but I got to know him because of my police career, and then later was going to write a book about him. After I retired and he got out of prison, he did about 10 years in jail, and then we wound up being in The Irishman together as actors. And the way that came about was one of the stars of The Irishman was hoping to speak to a real life hitman just to as a sort of a technical advisor, and somebody reached out to me because they knew that I had contacts like that, and I put them in touch with this guy Larry Mazza, and as a result, we both wound up getting a part in the movie. We had to audition and everything, but we got a part in the movie. So the police job in the end was really a phenomenal thing for me. It gave me more credibility when I wrote the Rifkin book. Had I just been a guy that went to college with him, maybe nobody would have been that interested. One of the taglines, which I didn't make up, but I think would have generated interest to a potential reader, was inside the mind of a killer by the cop who knew him as a friend. So it's been a great thing, and I wish that I could have appreciated all of that as a younger person.
So just talk about your segue into acting.
I've always been interested in movies. That was something I've always dreamed of doing. Being involved somehow, not necessarily as an actor, but being involved somehow. So back in 2017, a childhood friend of mine, Mike Domino, we made a movie called The Expediter, it's on Amazon. It's probably like the worst movie. Actually, the one review says it's the worst movie ever made. It's a 45-minute movie. But then we followed that up with a movie called Mott Haven, Cash for Keys, which is actually Nice little movie. We co-wrote it, and then we co-produced it, totally self-financed. We got Robert Davi, actor, Chuck Zito. We got some other, pretty respectable actors in there, Paul Wilson. And then the Irishman came along. I had to audition. A couple of people were in the running for my part, but that was thrilling. I mean, how do you to go work for Martin Scorsese and actually deal with him? We dealt with him both days. Just a bundle of positive energy. When I was doing my scene, I did it with the assistant director, probably 10 times, and then Mr. Scorsese came down, and he came right up to me, and before he came up to me, all of the other extras, there were extras in the barber shop, there were extras in the hotel lobby, and there were probably 50 extras. And all of the action was centered around did you see the movie?
Yeah.
All of it was centered around my walk.
Yeah.
So,
it's a lot of camera time.
yeah. So, all of these extras are people he's probably used before. So he shows up, and everybody's going, "Hey, Mr. Scorsese, no, hey, Marty," and he's going, "Hey, how you doing? How's your mother? How's your you got any of that chicken parmesan?" He knew something personal about all of them, and they all wanted his attention, and he just looked like he valued seeing them again because he probably used them. It's all uncredited roles because they're just the background people. But I think he uses the same people over and over, and he just was so gracious to them. And then he comes up to me, who he's never met, and he's going, "What do you think? What do you think? You think you should? Would you feel comfortable holding a newspaper? What about a hat? What about a cigar? What do you think?" And he's like asking me and actually listening to my answers. So we tried it over and over, with a newspaper in my arm, with a cigar, without a cigar, with a hat, without a hat. We wound up doing it without the hat, which surprised me because it seemed like everybody back then wore hats. But I thought it went great without the hat. But it was just such a pleasure dealing with him. The only problem is, as I tell everybody, is when you wind up in a big movie like that with him, the master, there's nowhere to go but down. So back in the early 2000s, Jerry Quarry and I went up to a prison upstate to see a childhood friend of ours who was serving a very heavy sentence for attempted kidnapping or unlawful imprisonment. He tried to kidnap a woman like in the middle of the night. Very serious crime. And him and Jerry had been, all of us had been very friendly when we were in high school, junior high school. And when I made the arrangements to go up there, I told the woman that, this guy might Jerry going there might create a bit of a stir. So could we visit our guy like privately or something? And she said, "Well, why don't you ask Mr. Quarry if he would do an AA meeting?" She goes, "I'm in AA, and I know that he's very active in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. Would he like to do a meeting up here?" So I mentioned it to him. He was all for it. So we go up to the prison, and Jerry's given this impassioned talk to mostly black inmates. I think there was one or two white guys, probably 30, 40 black guys, and our friend who's white. And Jerry's, Jerry's very good when he gives those talks. And what touched me more than anything with that day was this black guy that looked like, he'd really had a rough life. He was doing a very heavy sentence. He was banged up, his face was banged up. And he says, "Mr. Quarry, I can't thank you enough for coming here and telling us about pain and universal pain and the pain of the turmoil of your childhood. Because when I used to watch you on TV, I thought you were the big, good-looking white guy with a silver spoon in your mouth. And I never could have imagined, and the guy's crying, and he goes, I never could have imagined you and I had anything in common. And by this point, Jerry's emotional, I'm emotional, everybody's crying in the place. And on the way home, from that trip, and I had gone up to see this guy again with Jerry a few times, but on the way home, that's when I decided I was going to become a social worker. So just this guy spilling his guts, I never could have imagined that you and me had something in common. And Jerry's response was, pain's universal, man.
Let's see them smile. There you go.